European Civilization, Protestantism and Catholicity compared in their effects on the civilization of Europe, by Jaime Balmes. Chapter 11, The Positive Doctrines of Protestantism Repugnant to the Instinct of Civilization. The best proof of the extreme weakness of Protestantism, considered as a body of doctrine, is the little influence which its positive doctrines have exercised in European civilization. I call its positive doctrines those which it attempts to establish as its own, and I distinguish them thus from its other doctrines, which I call negative, because they are nothing but the negation of authority. The latter found favor on account of their conformity with the inconstancy and changeableness of the human mind, but the others, which have not the same means of success, have all disappeared with their authors, and are now plunged in oblivion. The only part of Christianity which has been preserved among Protestants is that which was necessary to prevent European civilization from losing among them its nature and character, and this is the reason why the doctrines which had too direct a tendency to alter the nature of this civilization have been repudiated, we should rather say despised by it. There is a circumstance here well worthy of attention, and which has not perhaps been noticed, viz. The fate of the doctrine held by the first reformers with respect to free will. It is well known that one of the first and most important errors of Luther and Calvin consisted in denying free will. We find this fatal doctrine professed in the works which they have left us. Does it not seem that this doctrine ought to have preserved its credit among the Protestants, and that they ought to have fiercely maintained it, since such is commonly the case with errors which serve as a nucleus in the formation of a sect? It seems also that Protestantism, being widely spread and deeply rooted in several countries of Europe, this fatalist doctrine ought to have exercised a strong influence on the legislation of Protestant nations. Wonderful as it is, such has not been the case. European moralists have despised it. Legislation has not adopted it as a basis. Civilization has not allowed itself to be directed by a principle which sapped all the foundations of morality, and which, if once applied to morals and laws, would have substituted for European civilization and dignity the barbarism and debasement of Mahometanism. There is no doubt that this fatal doctrine has perverted some individuals. It has been adopted by sects more or less numerous, and it cannot be denied that it has affected the morality of some nations. But it is also certain that, in the generality of the great human family, governments, tribunals, administration, legislation, science, and morals have not listened to this horrible doctrine of Luther, a doctrine which strips man of his free will, which makes God the author of sin, which charges the Creator with the responsibility of all the crimes of his creatures, and represents him as a tyrant, by affirming that his precepts are impossible, a doctrine which monstrously confounds the ideas of good and evil, and removes all stimulus to good deeds by teaching that faith is sufficient for salvation, and that all the good works of the just are only sins. Public opinion, good sense, and morality here side with Catholicity. Those even who in theory embrace these fatal religious doctrines usually reject them in practice. This is because Catholic instruction on these important points has made so deep an impression on them, because so strong an instinct of civilization has been communicated to European society by the Catholic religion. Thus the Church, by repudiating the destructive errors taught by Protestantism, preserved society from being debased by these fatalist doctrines. The Church formed a barrier against the despotism which is enthroned wherever the sense of dignity is lost. She was a fence against the demoralization which always spreads whenever men think themselves bound by blind necessity, as by an iron chain. She also freed the human mind from the state of abjection into which it falls whenever it thinks itself deprived of the government of its own conduct, and of the power of influencing the course of events. In condemning these errors of Luther, which were the bond of Protestantism at its birth, the Pope raised the alarm against an eruption of barbarism into the order of ideas. She saved morality, laws, public order, and society. The Vatican, by securing the noble sentiment of liberty in the sanctuary of conscience, preserved the dignity of man. By struggling against Protestant ideas, by defending the sacred deposit confided to it by its divine master, the Roman See became the tutelary divinity of future civilization. Reflect on these great truths. Understand them thoroughly, you who speak of religious disputes with cold indifference, with apparent mockery and pity, as if they were only scholastic puerilities. Nations do not live on bread alone. They live also on ideas, on maxims which, converted into spiritual aliment, give them greatness, strength, and energy, or, on the contrary, weaken them, reduce them, and condemn them to stupidity. Look over the face of the globe. Examine the periods of human history. Compare times with times and nations with nations, and you will see that the Church, by giving so much importance to the preservation of these transcendent truths, by accepting no compromise on this point, has understood and realized better than any other teacher the elevated and salutary maxim that truth ought to reign in the world, that on the order of ideas depends the order of events, and that when these great problems are called in question, the destinies of humanity are involved. Let us recapitulate what we have said. The essential principle of Protestantism is one of destruction. This is the cause of its incessant variations, of its dissolution and annihilation. As a particular religion, it no longer exists, for it has no peculiar faith, no positive character, no government, nothing that is essential to form an existence. Protestantism is only a negative. If there is anything to be found in it of a positive nature, it is nothing more than vestiges and ruins. All is without force, without action, without the spirit of life. It cannot show an edifice raised by its own hands. It cannot, like Catholicity, stand in the midst of its vast works and say, "These are mine." Protestantism can only sit down on a heap of ruins and say with truth, "I have made this pile." As long as sectarian fanaticism lasted, as long as this flame, enkindled by furious declamation, was kept alive by unhappy circumstances, Protestantism showed a certain degree of force, which, although it was not the sign of vigorous life, at least indicated the convulsive energy of delirium. But that period has passed. The action of time has dispersed the elements that fed the flame, and none of the attempts which have been made to give to the Reformation the character of a work of God have been able to conceal the fact that it was the work of human passions. Let us not be deceived by the efforts which are now being made. What is acting under our eyes is not living Protestantism. It is the operations of false philosophy, perhaps of policy, sometimes of sordid interest disguised under the name of policy. Everyone knows how powerful Protestantism was in exciting disturbances and causing disunion. It is on this account that evil-minded men search in the bed of this exhausted torrent for some remains of its impure waters, and knowing them to contain a deadly poison, present them to the unsuspecting in a golden cup. But it is in vain for weak man to struggle against the arm of the Almighty. God will not abandon his work. Notwithstanding all his attempts to deface the work of God, man cannot blot out the eternal characters which distinguish truth from error. Truth in itself is strong and robust. As it is the ensemble of the relations which unite things together, it is strongly connected with them, and cannot be separated either by the efforts of man or by the revolution of time. Error, on the contrary, the lying image of the great ties which bind together the compact mass of the universe, stretches over its usurped domain like those dead branches of the forest which, devoid of sap, afford neither freshness nor verdure, and only serve to impede the advance of the traveler. Confiding men, do not allow yourselves to be seduced by brilliant appearances, pompous discourse, or false activity. Truth is open, modest, without suspicion, because it is pure and strong. Error is hypocritical and ostentatious, because it is false and weak. Truth resembles a woman of real beauty, who, conscious of her charms, despises the affectation of ornament. Error, on the contrary, paints and ornaments herself because she is ugly, without expression, without grace, without dignity. Perhaps you may be pleased with its laborious activity. Know then that it has no strength but when it is the rallying cry of a faction. Then indeed it is rapid in action and fertile in violent measures. It is like the meteor, which explodes and vanishes, leaving behind it nothing but darkness, death, and destruction. Truth, on the contrary, like the sun, sends forth its bright and steady beams, fertilizes with its genial warmth, and sheds on every side life, joy, and beauty.